Dan Schulman, welcome to Jewish Money Matters. It's such a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
Really, congratulations on your new book. Your latest book is The Money Kings. I'm going to show it here for anybody who watches our video later on, although this is mostly audio, but The Money Kings, the epic story of the Jewish immigrants who transformed Wall Street and shaped modern America. Fascinating read, incredible work. I'm halfway through it. I'm so enjoying this work. Daniel, let's first start with your personal connection with this often, I guess, misunderstood part of American history and Jewish history. What was the personal impetus for you to embark on this massive project, and how did you even land on this idea?
It was a bit circuitous, honestly, and I didn't realize my personal connection until I was a little bit a ways into this project. But I had finished my first book, Sons of Wichita, came out, and I was sort of looking for a new project, and I was interested in a big dynastic story. Sons of Wichita was a book about the Koch family. And just my process is to sort of go down rabbit holes and research all sorts of different things. And I was in the process of doing that. And I got fascinated by this wave of anarchist violence that occurred in the United States at the turn of the century, and
Mm-hmm.
ended up targeting a lot of, the robber barons of that era, folks like J.P. Morgan. But the name Jacob Schiff also came up in my research as a recipient of one of these letter bombs, and I began researching him. And I was stunned that no one had done a big biography on him because of, he had turned around the Union Pacific Railroad. He was just one of the top financiers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Just an amazing person. And so I sort of decided that I was going to focus on Schiff. And the way my personal connection to the story, or my family's connection to the story, comes in is Schiff played a massive role in helping Jews to immigrate from Russia and the Pale of Settlement in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And my father's family were from that region, and they came over in one of these waves of immigration, settled in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, in a tenement. Similar story to many American Jews. And while their lives couldn't have been any different from, Jacob Schiff or the other people I write about in this book, Marcus Goldman, the Lehmans, at this time in American history, these two spheres, the Upper East Side contingent of the German Jewish elite and
Mm-hmm.
the impoverished immigrants, were very much, tethered by the fact that as Jews they were in this together. So I sort of realized that, my grandparents would have had to know the name Jacob Schiff. There was no more famous American Jew. He was the sort of informal leader of American Jewry, and that's sort of, I write
Yeah.
about this. I write about this a little bit in the introduction to my book.
Yeah. Yeah. It's incredible, like you said, that nobody had written anything really formally about him and his contribution, his life.
Yeah, I mean, he'd been the source of a lot of academic study there, but there had been no major biography of Schiff, who, in my view, he was a contemporary of J.P. Morgan, and they collaborated and were sometimes rivals. But in my view, Morgan is often thought of as the most important financial figure in American history, really.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Schiff could definitely easily assert a claim to that title when you factor in both his financial contribution, but also his philanthropy, including in building basically a social safety net for Jewish immigrants who were fleeing persecution.
Like your family, for example.
Like my family, like the families of millions of
Right.
American Jews.
Right.
That's sort of his legacy. The fact that
Yeah.
there's an American Jewish community at all sort of traces back to this era.
Right. So as you embark in exploring his life, then you start piecing together the lives of other people like Schiff, who also had such an influence and contribution both in the world of Wall Street and the Jewish world.
Yeah, I mean, I was initially considering would I just do a biography of Schiff, and then, you realize his world includes people like the founders of Goldman Sachs
Right.
and Lehman and J&W Seligman and Company, which few people know about today, but at during its era was one of the best known investment banks. And
Right.
it just fascinated me to think that, Jacob Schiff is taking his Sunday morning walk up to Montefiore Hospital with Sam Sachs of Goldman
Mm-hmm.
Sachs. So it was just so closely
Yeah.
knit. And in order to tell the full story, you really want to bring in these other amazing characters who together played not just an incredible role in the evolution of modern finance, but in the evolution of Jewish philanthropy and
Right.
institutions that sort of supported it.
Right. The term Money Kings is not unique to your book. It was used before. Share with us in what context.
Yeah, so Money Kings, this is something that I write about a little bit in the book because Money Kings was the term that was used at the turn of the century by the pundits and the papers to describe the major financiers of that era. So Jacob Schiff was often referred to in the papers as a money king, but so was John Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan as
Hmm.
well. Um, and using that term was a bit of a conscious choice on my part because obviously it carries some, anti-Semitic tropes within it.
Right.
Um, and the decision to use that title was, basically Jacob Schiff never sort of received his historical due, in part because he was Jewish. He could never be just a banker or just an investment banker. He had to be a German Jewish.
Yeah. He was always going to be the Jew.
He was always going to be the Jew. And as much as anything, this is a book, it's a book about finance, it's a book about, the greatest era of Jewish philanthropy. It's also about the rise of modern anti-Semitism
Hmm.
and these conspiracy theories about Jewish control and Jewish money and Jewish power. Um, so I thought to myself, well, I wouldn't hesitate to write a book about Morgan or Rockefeller and call it Money King or Money King.
Right.
So why would I not, write a book about Schiff and Marcus Goldman and the Lehmans and call it Money Kings? They undoubtedly were. And so that was the choice.
Yeah, yeah. Which you speak a little bit into your introduction about somewhat you being somewhat of skeptic or having some trepidation to embark on the project because of the potential that it might have to fuel anti-Semitism. What changed your mind and said, no, I'm going all in on this? And how do you feel? I'm curious, how do you feel now that you've put out this book in a world that is exponentially more anti-Semitic? Actually, I should say exponentially more openly anti-Semitic than the one we lived in when you began to write this book.
It's fascinating because in a horrifying way, the book became so much more relevant than
Yeah.
I thought it was ever going to be. It came out, the hardcover uh, of the book came out a month after October 7th. Uh,
Wow.
so but so my initial reluctance is when you look up the name Jacob Schiff, if you were to Google his name or
Hmm.
Google it when I started this, um, 9 or 10 years ago, the results that are going to come up mostly are, white supremacists and conspiracy theorists basically saying, Jacob Schiff was the most important figure in modern history because he was the puppeteer of all these events, and they would cherry pick from his, biography. And
Uh-huh.
as all conspiracy theories, there's just a nugget of truth somewhere, and then they surround it with just
Right.
lies and innuendo. Um, and I just increasingly, and I did worry, would if you write about Jewish money and Jewish power, this is what this book is about.
Right.
Um, do white supremacists end up, using this to bolster their ridiculous case?
Hmm.
But I thought this book was more important than ever to write in order to explain where some of these myths come from and how they became basically part of the atmosphere, the political
Yeah.
atmosphere. Um, and yeah, so that's why I decided it was more important than ever to just write the story and to do it in a straightforward way. And
Hmm.
sort of not to, they're just these were humans, and
Yeah.
they did a lot of good things. They did some bad things,
Right.
and I wasn't going to shade the bad stuff.
Yeah.
It's just important to just tell it as it
Yeah.
happened. But uh, you know, I write a little bit about Henry Ford in the book and his role in unleashing modern anti-Semitism, and I think that has suddenly become much more relevant because when I was growing up, while I was certainly aware of anti-Semitism, it was not as
Yeah.
your face as it currently is. And I think people
Right.
of our generation were probably lulled into thinking that it was waning. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly enough, Jacob Schiff and the people of his generation, they too thought it was going away.
Mm-hmm.
They thought they were on the cusp of a new era, only for it to come roaring back as we've seen.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's an instance in the book that kind of reminded me of what we've experienced as of late, where, this narrative of I'm not anti-Jewish, I'm anti-Zionist, right? And the book we see it as I'm not anti-Hebrews, I'm anti a certain type of them. Tell us about that.
Yeah, there was an interesting, I mean, so basically what happens is there were a couple of major waves of Jewish immigration to
Mm-hmm.
the United States. Some Sephardic Jews were among the first to settle in the United States, and they sort of became well established. And then the German Jews come in the 1840s around, and many of them end up coming to the United States because of these revolutions that break out throughout Europe. And people like the Lehmans and the Goldmans are considered really the sort of gauche, new money, ostentatious, and
Mm-hmm.
Jews. And whereas the Hebrews, which is how some people referred to the Sephardic Jews who were more
Oh.
established, that was sort of where that traces back to. And there was one thing that I write about in the book is there was this sort of major anti-Semitic episode where the banker Joseph Seligman, who was one of the most famous bankers of his era, goes to stay at a hotel that he's gone to every year with his family and is told that he can't stay there that year because
Mm-hmm.
they're not allowing Jews there. Um, he's obviously indignant about this, and this major fight breaks out in the press between his camp, and the sort of steward of this hotel, where this fellow goes in the New York Times, elaborates on the differences between a Jew and a Hebrew. And yeah, but on the issue of Zionism, it's really, I mean, this is another sort of modern echo in the book.
Right.
It's fascinating because, a lot of American Jews at the turn of the century, were opposed to Zionism because it was a little bit of a crazy idea.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Jacob Schiff was a major opponent of Zionism, and the reason for this was that at that time they thought the United States was going to be the Jewish refuge. They thought that
Uh-huh.
was going to be their Zion, and of course, world events start to make it possible, make the Zionist dream possible through the Balfour Declaration. And simultaneously, Schiff and his allies have been, spending decades trying to keep the doors of immigration open, only for them to be really slammed shut in the wake of World War One.
One.
So it just becomes an impossibility for Jews, and not just Jews, but other immigrants who were sort of deemed undesirable to settle in any great number in the United States.
So he changes his tune on that?
He died in 1920, but before
Mm.
he died, he was edging closer and closer to he came very close to joining the Zionist movement, but he was always uncomfortable with the idea of a Jewish state because he
Mm-hmm.
thought that it could underscore this age-old canard that Jews have dual loyalties.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and and of course, even today, doesn't matter if you live in Israel, or not, Jews are often painted with the same brush. So you can sort of understand where some of his worries came from. But he came very close and just got to I think he said he got to the threshold, and and perhaps if he'd lived longer, he might have joined
Mm-hmm.
the Zionist movement, but he died in 1920.
Right, right. Another narrative, anti-Semitic narrative that you encountered in this book, and you alluded to it earlier, is that of the Jewish banker, puppeteering world events. Can you tell us a little bit about that and some specific instances that fueled this narrative?
This is really fascinating. This is a really fascinating part of Jacob Schiff's story, and this comes back to what I was saying about how sometimes conspiracy theorists often take one little nugget of truth and build a body of lies around it. Um, one of the amazing chapters of Jacob Schiff's career is that he helps to fund the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War, which breaks out in 1905. Now, Japan was the underdog in this war. Everybody thought that Russia was going to trounce Japan. And Japan's financial emissaries are crisscrossing the globe looking to get financing. And they're
Mm-hmm.
being turned down by bankers who say, like, yeah, we're not going to touch this. They get to Schiff, and Schiff says, yes, I'll finance, I'll underwrite your bonds. And it ends up being a major financial success, for one thing,
Mm-hmm.
because it turns out that Japan starts winning some major battles, and that sort of starts to turn things around. But over the course of this war, Schiff and Kuhn Loeb, his investment bank, end up funding probably a quarter of Japan's war expenditures, which is
Wow.
an incredible amount. Um, but now a lot of people would point to this as a banker sort of pulling the strings on world events. But if you strip it of all the historical context, you're like, huh, that's a banker funding a war, okay. But that's how wars were funded in those days.
Mm-hmm.
Banks, J.P. Morgan and company were major financial backers of the Allies um, during World War I, for instance, and even sort of took a direct role in, helping to provision the army through uh, by serving as like almost a requisitioning house. Um, so that's one piece of it. But the other piece of it is that the reason Jacob Schiff does this is because uh, Jews are being forced out of Russia by the thousands,
Right.
and by discriminatory policies, by mob violence that's basically sanctioned by the authorities. Um, these Jews are flooding into New York. And, Schiff and his allies have made the decision to basically that they're going to take care of their own and make sure that the Jews that are coming to the United States in droves do not become public charges.
Mm-hmm.
And they're doing this for a couple of reasons, both, um, out of compassion for their brethren, but also because they're afraid this new wave of Jews is going to bring down the image of that the German Jewish elite have tried so hard to maintain. So Schiff has worked for decades to try to pressure the Russian regime to ease up on its Jewish population in order to prevent all of these Jews from flooding in to the United States. But he's unsuccessful in this.
Mm-hmm.
So his reason for funding the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War is to explicitly, teach Russia a lesson and potentially to cause some sort of regime change there.
Right.
So again, this sort of feeds into all of these conspiracy theories about the all-powerful Jewish banker that would
Right.
just continue to metastasize.
Right, right, right. As I'm hearing you speak, I'm curious, Daniel, is there one character in the book that you became more fond of the more you dug into their history? Is it Schiff? Is it somebody else?
Oh, I think, yeah, Schiff just fascinates me on, on just many different levels. I don't think he was necessarily, if you were a member of his family, he was probably not an easy person to year round. He was very exacting, and with his children, extremely demanding and in some cases domineering. But it's just there was no more powerful uh financier of that era. Um and I just appreciated how he was unabashed in using his financial power for good, or at least what he
Mhm.
thought was good. He really had no qualms with doing that. What was also interesting about him is while he was this amazing financier, he always made time. In fact, he seemed to prioritize his work within the Jewish community and his philanthropic work.
Right.
Uh,
I noticed that. It was like really, really, he was really immersed in it.
Immersed, he was so immersed that, every day there would be, communal workers tramping to the Kuhn Loeb offices to meet with Schiff, because there was no major decision was made within the Jewish community without getting his advice or his blessing. Uh,
Wow.
and he was just an amazing guy. And I think this is a great habit for anyone. I don't know, like if you keep a to-do list, but I try to keep a to-do list.
Yeah.
I don't always get to everything on it, but apparently Schiff was legendary for, every day he had this ivory, I guess this is how, like, had an ivory tablet that he would write down everything he needed to do in the day. And he wouldn't, be able to like go to sleep until that last thing was checked
Oh
up.
my.
Yeah.
Oh my. We have some work to do.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, but I mean, I think I was just, Schiff is fascinating, but also his partner Otto Kahn, who was, very unschiff-like in many different ways. Schiff was extremely rigid and proper, and um, Kahn was singing opera at the top of his lungs in the office, and cavorting with stage girls, um, and just loved art and music, and he too was an incredible figure. I mean, I think some of the characters in this book are just, the characters that are part of the story are just incredible, all in their own ways.
I know, they really are. Talking about partnerships, and you mentioned family, there's many of these families, as you show in the book, they marry into each other. It's something that we don't see as much today in the industry, obviously, because we're dealing with public companies. But tell us how some of these relationships through marriage worked, the advantages, the disadvantages.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the relationships that occurred within these very tightly held investment banking partnerships were through marriage. In fact, Jacob Schiff entered Kuhn Loeb because he married the daughter of one of its founders, Solomon.
Hmm.
If you look at a firm like Lehman Brothers, they didn't even allow, it wasn't even intermarriage. They only allowed Lehmans. You had to have the Lehman last name to 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 be a partner. But oftentimes you would rise in these firms because through marriage. And the reason why these family relationships were so important is because um, you know, in many cases, these Jewish firms were not able to do business necessarily with other firms, and they relied very, very heavily on family networks, uh,
Hmm.
including even before investment banking, like a family like the Seligmans, when they were in the importing business, they were relying on family members in Germany to help provide goods and that sort of thing. Now, you know who could you better trust than members of your family, especially when finance at that time was both simple and very complicated because you had very vast distances. And,
Right.
you were sending goods to Germany or to England, and you just sort of had to trust that you were going to get paid for this. So it was extremely important to do business with people that you trusted. Um, at the same time, we all know that blood and money doesn't always mix that well. So there were many instances where, being involved in business and, family affairs, it just became sort of a powder keg. Um,
Mm.
there's something that I write about in the book where, one of the Meyer Lehman, founder of Lehman Brothers, his brother-in-law, who was one of the who would acquire the Wells Fargo Bank. He was sort of one of California's best known Jewish financiers. He had money deposited with the Lehman Bank in New York, and there was a major financial crisis, and he needed to pull it out. And Meyer Lehman thought like that this guy was weakening them at a really inopportune time. So this leads to, 2 years of fighting within the family. So there were a lot of episodes like that. Within Goldman Sachs, the family politics grew so tense that especially during World War I, the cause of that was that Henry Goldman, who was the son of one of the firm's founders, was very pro-German, and
Mm-hmm.
the second generation German Jews were pro-ally, and this got to the point where it was actually starting to threaten. His pronouncements were sort of starting to threaten the company to some extent,
Wow.
and it led to a clash within the firm that resulted in Henry Goldman resigning, and no other Goldman working for Goldman Sachs after that. So it, it had its pros and it had its cons.
It's so interesting that that's just the way all these stories are weaved together. It's such a fascinating tapestry of history. What was the most surprising discovery from your research and writing this book?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question. I mean, I come back to, and I'm not sure if this is the most surprising thing, but one thing that I find myself often talking about is Henry Ford's legacy. And
Uh-huh.
I was aware, like most people are, that he was, extremely anti-Semitic.
Right.
What I didn't realize until doing the research for this book was that um, Schiff and the members of his firm were the sort of the prototypes of the international Jew, which was uh, Henry Ford had this paper called the Dearborn Independent that sort of turns its single-minded focus on attacking Jews for really everything you could imagine, and starts a series called The International Jew, the world's foremost problem. So not just a problem, but the world's literal biggest problem. Uh,
Wow.
Schiff ends up being a regular target, as well as the members of his firm, and for a variety of things. So what just amazed me was both how basically Ford helped to unleash modern anti-Semitism based on the protocols of Zion, which is what he was using to this newspaper was using to base these stories, the themes upon. Um, I was also, amazed by sort of the feedback loop between Ford and Hitler in Germany, um, which was what was something that I was not very aware of going into this project. I mean, when in the 1920s, when a New York Times reporter visits Hitler in Germany, because there's a
Mhm.
lot of rumors in Berlin that all of this money is flooding into the fledgling Nazi party. They've got new uniforms, and the paramilitary has new weapons, and they're paying people big salaries. And it's whispered that Henry Ford is helping to finance this. So a New York Times reporter goes and visits Hitler to interview him, and the first thing they notice is that there's a picture of Ford on the wall of Hitler's office, and in the room outside of there are German translations of a book with Ford's byline, and this was an anthology of articles that appeared in Ford's Dearborn Independent newspaper,
Oh
uh,
my
one
gosh.
of the International Jew, and the Nazis were blanketing Germany with copies of this book.
Oh my
So
gosh.
yeah, so that was one thing that really was sort of an aha moment for me, where I just sort of to realize that, a lot of what people are still dealing with today in terms of myths about Jewish finance and Jewish power, these modern myths got
Right.
to start during this era, and Henry Ford played a huge part in that.
Wow, wow, that is crazy. Any going back to the Jewish immigrants and the Jewish characters in this
Mhm.
book, any disappointing discoveries? You alluded to the fact that they were human and you painted a very balanced picture of their life. Anything that kind of disappointed you about these fellow Jews?
You know, interest as much as Schiff sort of would be the image of propriety and sound finance throughout his life, one thing that I noticed in my research, and I write about this in the book, is that he comes to the United States as an 18-year-old, and
Mhm.
very quickly gets into finance. Clearly, he's got connections from Germany, and he forms his own uh, his own investment house, and they're deeply immersed in funding the railroads, and
Mhm.
it's like a real financial wild west at that time. And his firm gets involved with a really shady railroad enterprise. It turns into a major scandal. There are questions about you know, whether it had been sort of bilking this railroad company, which ends up going bankrupt. Um, and it's a complicated story, but it's also one that's sort of a bit of a black mark on his legacy to some
Mhm.
extent. And in fact, he's sort of the firm closes down, and he ends up going back. He ends up going back to Germany for a period of time. Um, so certainly there was things like that.
Mhm.
But also I don't know if this is disappointing necessarily. I understand it. It makes sense, but you know, there was a lot of paternalism towards the Jewish immigrants that were coming to the United States, by not just Schiff, but other, you know, German Jewish stewards. I mean, they were even trying to control things to the extent of like making sure that Jews were not even coming to New York when they immigrated, because they were afraid of, the conditions on the Lower East Side becoming
Mhm.
control, and becoming a bad image problem. So Schiff ends up ends up funding this initiative that's called the Galveston movement, and the whole purpose of that was to make sure that Jews never made it to New York, because they were shipped basically straight from Europe to Texas, and
Right.
from there settled within the interior of the United States. Um, but but on the whole, I think you know, Schiff and the other figures in this book really did a lot to be commended for.
Yeah, I agree. There's that like it comes from a good place, but there's also that tension with what is also good for us, right? Like
Yeah,
we're trying to help our fellow Jews, but like we can't also hurt ourselves in the process. So
exactly.
it's hard to judge because how would we have reacted in the same situation? I have no idea, right?
I mean, it's you can see what they were contending with. It was,
Right.
the problem of immigration was something that would keep Schiff up at night in terms of how to grapple with it,
Right.
because they were raising such enormous amounts of money to help the Jewish immigrants that were coming over in all
Right.
sort of facets of their life. So I guess I can understand it, but you sort of read this stuff today, you learn about it today, and you just sort of cock an eyebrow at it.
Right, right. But it's beautiful to see the sense of responsibility that he really felt. Um, Again, going back,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's an amazing thing. There's also that, I guess maybe it was a little bit surprising to me because when we read about the fact that that some of these immigrants own slaves, right? Right?
Yeah, that's a lot. I mean, that's a fascinating part of the book. So that's the Lehman family, the Lehman family and the Seligman family originally that migrate to the South, and the Lehmans
Hmm.
end up in Montgomery. The Seligmans actually return north, and part of the reason for that might have been that they were sort of uncomfortable with the slaveholding culture. But, the Lehmans very, very quickly assimilate to the South, and they're in the dry goods business, but cotton is the cash crop of the South. They're doing business in cotton, and of course, this is a trade that's powered by slavery.
Right.
They own slaves, and in fact, after the Civil War, if not previous, um, they managed plantations, and that labor system was not much better than slavery during the Reconstruction era. So how do you reconcile that as
Right.
a Jewish person? Um, the one, as I sort of searched for an explanation to that, one thing sort of jumped out at me, which was that when they first arrive in Montgomery, Alabama, they were rated by a credit reporting agency. It's kind of ledgers still exist today, and they're not, the entries in there aren't really dry. There's a lot of interesting details in there about about the proprietors of firms across the United States. So and so has a drinking problem, so you should probably stay away from this company.
Yeah, I did notice that. I was like, whoa, that's
Yeah.
so interesting.
And in their case, the first notation in the credit report ledger is about the fact that they're Jews, and
Right.
they shouldn't be trusted because they're Jewish. And what's interesting is that 10 years down the line, the entry says something like, they're well respected, they can be trusted for all of their business, almost as good as white men. So what I take away from that is that they weren't viewed as white men, and that by owning slaves and by striving to assimilate to the Southern culture, that might have made them feel more Southern and more white. And
Yeah.
certainly they weren't alone among, Jews who migrated to the South who did own slaves. But even then, the sort of hypocrisy of this was well understood. There was a congressional debate that I write about in the book where someone attacked Judah Benjamin, who was a senator from Louisiana who would later take a role in the Confederate government, over the issue of slavery. And this other senator refers to Israelites with Egyptian principles. So it was like, it was understood. It was understood. Um, but the Lehman certainly, that just a fascinating story.
Yeah. This actually brings me to assimilation, Daniel. Some of the characters, as you just shared, and even further later in the book, as we encounter Schiff and his contemporaries, some of the characters in the book look to assimilate, and where there were others who tried to hold on to their traditions a little bit more tightly. I guess after learning their stories, did anything change in your mind, in your maybe in your view on assimilation, or did it confirm any of your beliefs? Did you form a stronger opinion about it? For example, I guess what I'm getting at is I think our history has shown us that assimilation is maybe what might fuel the dislike and the distrust of the Jew. It's almost like it's counterintuitive, right? The more we try to assimilate, the more distrust there is, even though we think it's the contrary. And I think maybe as American Jews, we're probably waking up to this fact. What are your thoughts?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, certainly, it's hard to say one way or the other, because the German Jews were leaving a country that, ghettoized them, and
Right.
where they weren't citizens, where they couldn't own property, where they were told where they could live or where they could and couldn't live, and they were taxed for
Right.
certain places. So one of the reasons that the Lehmans came over to the United States is because this was the second, third, and fourth born sons who come over. And they were not going to be able to live in the village that they grew up in, because there was a quota system. So Reform Judaism sort of springs up in Germany as sort of this philosophy that Judaism needs to change with the times, evolve
Mm-hmm.
with the times, and it's an assimilationist sort of ideology. Now, all of the people that I write about in the book were, assimilationists. And that was one of the biggest things that they were trying to do when Jewish immigrants came to the United States, was to Americanize them. And during the early 1900s, there was a backlash against hyphenated Americanism, being an Italian American or a Jewish American. Everybody was supposed to be just an
American.
Um, Now, the result of this, in many cases, is that, a lot of the Jewish traditions were lost along the way, and especially within these families,
Yeah.
they, to integrate themselves with American society, and not to be seen as the other. They're like celebrating Christmas. Some of the, sons and daughters of these families grow up and they don't even know that they're Jewish. um and what's interesting is that the Schiff family today, who are fantastic, and who were a great resource for this book, they're Episcopalians. And it's just sort of so, they care very deeply about their Jewish history, but that's just the way it
Wow.
went. And I mean, even in the early 90s, Schiff was worried about this sort of thing
Hmm.
happening. So maybe it's a double-edged sword in certain ways, right?
Yeah. 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 I hear. If you had to sit with any of them, the characters, Seligman, Schiff, any of the Lehmans, is there anything that now, if you had the opportunity to sit with any of these people, anything you would question, anything that you'd say, I would love to know more about this, about why you made that choice? Anything that's like, I wish I could have a chance to ask one question.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it would be Schiff too. And one of the decisions that he makes near the end of his life, and this comes back to Henry Ford. Henry Ford is starting to go on this rampage, and Schiff had been so vigilant about anti-Semitism. He would just not tolerate it. And he would, at the slightest hint of anti-Semitism, he would, go to the president, or something.
Hmm.
He was constantly banging down the doors of mayors and governors and presidents and treasury secretaries. Um, but in this case, he decides that the best course is not to do anything. And he dies shortly thereafter. But I would love to understand, a bit more about where he was coming from
Right.
in that moment and why he made such an uncharacteristic decision.
Yeah. I wonder if at this point he was burned out or just despondent or lost hope, or who knows?
Yeah, it might have. I think he was just he was sort of elderly, and he might not have just been up for that
Battle. Yeah.
fight, or had worried that by virtue of even making this public or having this public fight, it would give more attention to
Right.
allegations, which I think was his concern. Uh,
Hmm.
but I think that would be an interesting.
Yeah.
That would be
Definitely.
interesting. I'd love to ask the Lehmans about slavery,
Yeah.
and how they viewed that. Um, you know, and I'd love to ask Joseph Seligman about, this great battle he had with the head of the Grand Union Hotel. And
Hmm.
it would be amazing to be able to talk to any one of them,
Yeah.
about their lives.
Yeah, yeah, they really sound like very special people who had tough decisions to make, as often comes with when you're in a position of power and when you have to, channel your money in
Absolutely.
different, right?
Absolutely. And I think there were, I never thought of this as necessarily a book about Jewish history as much as a book about American history. Again, this comes back to this issue of, because they were Jewish, they were always sort of, characterized that way. But in reality, when you look at their accomplishments and what they did, they were sort of pivotal to the development of the United States.
Right, right. And also the fact that they were Jewish, there's a value system that informs the way the choices they make and how they behave.
Yeah, and I think you saw that a lot with Schiff and his philanthropy, where he really viewed that through the Jewish concept, uh,
Right.
that it was an obligation, and you know, and it was about justice, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and he didn't like the word charity, um, and so I think you're right that they did view it
Yeah.
through the sort of lens.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting that you say that he didn't like the word charity because it's true. In Judaism, the word tzedakah actually does not mean charity. It
Right.
means doing what's right.
Right.
It's not optional, it's an obligation, period.
Exactly. And that was how he especially that's how he especially viewed it and how he taught his children
Mm,
to view it.
yeah, yeah. Speaking of that, any other lessons about money that as you've embarked on this journey and learned so much about these individuals of such influence, any lessons about money itself that we can take with us as we're looking to, have I guess, a more positive, healthier relationship with this resource, which often people have like mixed feelings about. What other things do you think we can learn?
I mean, I think that I'm sure many people understand this, but is that, money can in some cases can be toxic within families, and
Mm,
that um in the end, I think there's this one interesting part of about in the book where Jacob Schiff is on the Nile and he's taking a trip and they're sort of floating past um you know the the pyramids and the dusty this dusty empire, and he sort of has a realization that everything is just temporary. We're all here just for a short period of time, and it all goes away. Uh,
yeah,
so I'm not sure if that's necessarily a money lesson, but I think of that a lot when I try to think about what's the most important, you know?
yeah, yeah. It's such a good one, and it goes back to his concern for philanthropy, for tzedakah, right? Like this, just that understanding that it's not just about what I built here, but kind of like what I leave behind.
Yes. And so, I mean, and I think that's another sort of interesting lesson about money and about legacy and what people do with their money, and in order to have at least what they feel is going to have be a positive
Mm-hmm.
effect
Hmm.
on society.
Yeah,
So I think money's not worth that much if you're not doing something beneficial with it.
I agree and I agree. And I have a feeling many of the characters in the book would agree with you. Dan Schulman, thank you so much for the opportunity. The book again is The Money Kings, fascinating read, the epic story of the Jewish immigrants who transformed Wall Street and shaped modern America. Everybody should go out and read it. Tell us where we can connect with you and learn more about your work.
Well, you can find me on Blue Sky. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me over at Mother Jones, where I'm the deputy editor for news and politics. You can find me at your local bookstore, So
Amazing.
please, the paperback just came out, so by
Oh,
all,
great.
yes, it's a great
Great.
Hanukkah gift, a great stocking stuffer.
Oh,
Whatever.
look, Hanukkah gift also. People, get on it. This is a fascinating
Exactly.
book.
Yep.
Dan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful work. Thank you.
Thanks so much.